Inspector Francis Fitzgerald, RCMP, Fort McPherson Detachment, Northwest Territories, December 21, 1910. The temperature at departure was -40. He had been in the north for 6 years. He knew the Fort McPherson territory, the Peel River ice, the Delta crossings, the specific character of Arctic cold when it settled into the Willows in December, and the trail conditions that followed. He had made the Dawson Patrol once before, southbound from Dawson City to Fort McPherson in 1906–07. He had not made it northbound, over the mountain divide, in the other direction, in winter, without a guide who knew that section of the trail from the Fort McPherson side. He left Fort McPherson at 8 in the morning with 3 men, Constable George Kinney, Constable Richard Taylor, and Special Constable Sam Carter. 4 men. 4 dog teams. Provisions calculated for the trail as Fitzgerald understood it. The annual patrol to Dawson City was an institutional tradition the RCMP had been running since 1904. The round trip demonstrated Canadian presence and sovereignty across 600 miles of Arctic winter. Fitzgerald had made the southbound crossing. He understood the patrol as a known route with documented conditions. What he was about to discover was that what he knew about the route and what the route required were not the same thing in every season, in every year, or in every direction. He did not take an indigenous guide who knew the specific mountain divide section from the Fort McPherson side. This decision is documented. Its consequences became the most studied failure of territory knowledge in the history of the RCMP. What did Inspector Fitzgerald know about the trail from Fort McPherson to Dawson City in December 1910, and what did he not know about it? What was the specific piece of territorial knowledge that the annual Dawson Patrol required, that had always been available to the patrols that completed it, and why was it not in the patrol that left Fort McPherson on the morning of December 21? The Dawson Patrol existed because Canada needed to demonstrate sovereign presence in the Yukon and Northwest Territories at the turn of the 20th century. The RCMP, operating in this period under the name Northwest Mounted Police until the force was renamed in 1920, was the instrument of that demonstration. A northern patrol in the 1900s was not a law enforcement exercise in the conventional sense. It was a sovereignty exercise, a mail run, a welfare check across hundreds of miles of Arctic territory, and a demonstration that Canada had an institutional presence in the north, that American commercial interests at Herschel Island and along the Yukon gold routes could not ignore. The patrol vehicle was the Komatik, the flatbed Arctic sled built for the specific load and terrain of northern travel, pulled by a dog team of 7 to 10 animals. An experienced RCMP dog team in good trail conditions could cover 20 to 25 miles a day. In soft snow, poor visibility, or extreme cold that prevented the dogs from running at pace, that could fall to 10 or 15. The Fitzgerald Patrol was planning for a route of approximately 475 miles. Provisions were calculated for 3 to 4 weeks. That calculation was not generous. What the institution could provide for an officer leaving Fort McPherson in December 1910 was a dog team, 3 to 4 weeks of provisions, patrol records from previous crossings, and a departure from headquarters that expected no communication until the patrol arrived in Dawson City. There was no radio. There was no check-in point. There was no mechanism for the institution in Regina to know anything about the patrol's condition once it left the Peel River ice and entered the mountain terrain. What the institution could not provide was the knowledge of the specific trail section over the mountain divide approached from Fort McPherson, the section that previous patrols had navigated with a guide who knew it, the section where the documented route and the actual route diverged, and the section where the difference between a correct and an incorrect drainage choice, made in the wrong visibility in January, did not allow for revision. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who moved through the same terrain in the same seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What Inspector Fitzgerald had from 6 years in the north was not enough for the mountain pass he could not find. And what was in that gap between what he knew and what the trail required is what this channel documents. And if you served in the RCMP Northern Divisions in this era, or your family did, or you have knowledge of the Dawson Patrol Route or the Fort McPherson Territory, put it in the comments. What did the Gwich'in community at Fort McPherson know about that Mountain Divide section that Fitzgerald did not take with him on December 21, 1910? The next video documents the first RCMP aircraft patrols in the north, what they gave the institution that the dog sled era could not, and what the dog sled era knew that no aircraft has ever been required to carry. Back on the trail. The annual Dawson Patrol had been running since 1904. In the 6 years before Fitzgerald departed Fort McPherson in December 1910, the patrol had been completed successfully every year. The officers who completed it had done so with specific knowledge of the route. Knowledge accumulated from previous crossings, passed from officer to officer through briefings and patrol records, and in the crucial mountain section, knowledge that came from Gwich'in guides who knew the specific terrain from the Fort McPherson side. The Dawson Patrol route was not a road. It was a traditional indigenous travel corridor that the RCMP had adopted as its patrol line. The trail crossed the Peel River, followed the Wind River drainage into the Mackenzie Mountains, crossed a specific divide at a specific elevation through a specific pass, and descended toward the Yukon River drainage and Dawson City. The specific location of that mountain pass, the correct drainage to follow up through the willows and into the tree line and over the divide, was knowledge that was not fully captured in the RCMP patrol records as written coordinates or text instructions. It existed in the experience of people who had made the crossing from that direction, in that season, with that specific terrain in front of them. Previous patrol officers had made the mountain section with indigenous guides who knew the pass from the Fort McPherson approach. That guide knowledge was not supplementary. In the mountain section, it was the operational core of the patrol. An experienced RCMP officer who had crossed the divide from the Dawson City side had descended into the Wind River country from above. He had not navigated up through the Wind River country from below and over the pass from the Fort McPherson side. These are not the same journey in the same terrain. The direction matters. The season matters. The specific approach matters. January on the Fort McPherson side of the divide is a different landscape than the same terrain experienced arriving from above in November. What had the Gwich'in community at Fort McPherson known about this mountain section that was not in the RCMP patrol records? And what happened over a period of weeks to the patrol that left Fort McPherson on December 21 without that knowledge anywhere in its team? By January 17, 1911, the Fitzgerald patrol had been on the trail for 27 days. They had not found the pass. They had followed wrong drainages. They had consumed provisions at the pace the terrain required. Cold camp, inadequate rest, dogs that needed feeding whether the day had produced forward progress or not. They were in the mountains. They had failed to cross the divide, and Fitzgerald made the decision to turn back. The decision to return was made at a point where the patrol's provisions were already critically reduced. The estimate from the patrol journals recovered with the bodies was that Fitzgerald calculated the remaining provisions could carry the party to Fort McPherson at a reasonable return pace. What the trail between the mountains and Fort McPherson required in late January and through February 1911, the specific conditions, the weakening dogs, the pace that cold camp and insufficient food imposed, was worse than that calculation allowed for. The 4 men died between approximately January 17 and February 17 to 18, 1911. Fitzgerald and Taylor died last, on the Peel River ice approximately 25 miles from Fort McPherson. Corporal William Dempster's rescue patrol found the bodies in March 1911. Fitzgerald's journal was recovered. It documented the patrol's progress, the failed attempts to find the pass, the turn-back decision, and the deteriorating condition of the team in the return weeks. The Fitzgerald patrol failed because a specific piece of territory knowledge, the location of the mountain pass on the Fort McPherson approach, was not in the patrol. That knowledge had been available for every successful crossing before 1910. It was in the Gwich'in community at Fort McPherson. It was carried by specific people who knew the trail from that direction and in that season. What is worth understanding precisely is the specific character of the knowledge that was absent. Not general Arctic experience, not general trail competence, but a particular directional route knowledge of a particular mountain pass that Fitzgerald did not have from his previous southbound crossing and could not have derived from his general northern service. What did the successful Dawson patrols have in their teams that the Fitzgerald patrol did not? And what does that comparison document about where the operational knowledge of the Arctic Trail actually lived? Every successful Dawson patrol before 1910 had navigated the Mountain Divide section with indigenous guidance or with officers who had built their specific route knowledge from indigenous sources. This is not a peripheral detail of Northern RCMP patrol history. It is the operational structure of how the Arctic Patrol worked. The Gwich'in people at Fort McPherson had been traveling the mountain routes between the Peel River drainage and the Yukon drainage for generations. The specific passes, the correct drainages, the seasonal conditions of each section of that terrain. This knowledge had been built and refined across centuries of deliberate travel in exactly this territory. An RCMP officer arriving at Fort McPherson brought general policing training, whatever Northern service experience he had accumulated, and the institutional patrol records of previous RCMP crossings. For the mountain section, those patrol records were not sufficient. The route was not a documented line on a map that could be followed by instruction. It was a set of specific decisions: which valley to follow, how far, what the terrain looked like when you were in the right place versus the wrong one, that existed in people who had made the journey. The RCMP's dependence on Gwich'in knowledge in the north during this period existed alongside the institution's role in enforcing policies that were causing serious harm to the same communities. The RCMP at Fort McPherson was responsible for enforcing regulations on indigenous communities, game and travel restrictions, and in the coming years, with growing institutional momentum, the enforcement of residential school attendance that would remove children from Gwich'in families. The officers whose lives depended on Gwich'in territorial knowledge were also the officers of the institution that was implementing policies the Truth and Reconciliation Commission later documented as deeply harmful to those same families. Both are true. The operational dependence and the institutional harm exist in the same historical moment and cannot be accurately understood in isolation from each other. What the Fitzgerald Patrol documented is the operational consequence of not honoring that knowledge relationship. The patrol needed what the Gwich'in community knew about the mountain pass. It did not take it. The result is recorded in the recovered journals. Corporal William John Duncan Dempster left Dawson City in late February 1911 with a small rescue party to search for the Fitzgerald Patrol, which was overdue. Dempster had been in the Yukon and northern Northwest Territories for years. He had made the Dawson Patrol himself. He knew the route in both directions. He had the territory knowledge that Fitzgerald's patrol had been missing in the critical section, not identical knowledge, because Dempster was approaching from the Dawson City side, but accumulated Northern Trail knowledge of depth and completeness that had come from specific years of specific travel in that specific terrain. Dempster's party found the bodies of Kinney and Taylor first, and then found Fitzgerald and Carter on the Peel River ice. The journals were detailed. They documented the patrol's attempts to locate the pass, the repeated failed choices of wrong drainages, the turnback decision, and the final weeks of deterioration. What Dempster's successful rescue mission documented was the operational difference between an officer with years of specific territory knowledge in that region and officers whose knowledge of the route was incomplete in the specific section that determined the patrol's outcome. Dempster navigated without difficulty on terrain that had defeated Fitzgerald. The difference was in what each man carried about that specific ground. Dempster's name is now on the highway that follows a portion of the traditional Gwich'in and patrol route he traveled. The Dempster Highway runs from Dawson City to Inuvik. It is paved. It has kilometer markers. The mountain pass that Fitzgerald could not find in January 1911 is now a surveyed section of a public road. The knowledge of where it is has been encoded into infrastructure that anyone can follow. What the Dempster Highway does not encode is what Dempster knew about that mountain terrain in January. The specific reading of ice and trail conditions, the weather pattern recognition, the route memory that years of northern travel had built in him. The highway knows the route. It does not know the road. What was the specific operational difference between what Corporal Dempster carried in his knowledge of the Dawson Patrol territory and what the Fitzgerald Patrol had in its team? And what does that difference tell us about where the knowledge of survival in the Canadian Arctic was actually held? The RCMP officers who served at Fort McPherson, Herschel Island, Aklavik, and the other early Arctic detachments were not transferred every 2 years. Many served multiple consecutive years in the same territory, attending the same communities and the same trail sections across multiple seasons. The specific operational knowledge they built was not supplementary to their institutional function. In the northern context, it was their institutional function. An officer at an Arctic detachment who did not know the ice conditions on the Peel River crossing in January, who did not know which community along the patrol route had a situation requiring attention before any call was made, who did not understand the specific weather patterns of the Delta in early winter. This officer was not less effective. He was, in specific operational moments, non-functional. Nothing else the institution provided substituted for that knowledge in the field. The Northern RCMP detachment in the early 20th century built something in the officers who stayed, a specific body of knowledge about specific terrain in specific seasons that no institutional system the RCMP had could replace or carry in parallel. This knowledge was not formally recorded. The patrol records documented routes and dates. They did not document what an officer who had crossed the Peel River 12 times knew about the difference between January and February ice in a heavy snow year versus a clear freeze year. That knowledge was in the officer. It left when the officer left. Before you can understand what the Fitzgerald Patrol was missing, you need to understand what the Northern posting model was producing in the officers who stayed. The officer who had been at Fort McPherson for 3 years, and the officer who had been there for 1 winter, were not equivalent operational resources in the mountain terrain. They were not equivalent at the river crossings. They were not equivalent in their knowledge of the communities along the patrol route, and what a specific call from a specific community in February meant in context. The difference between them was the specific accumulated experience of repeated travel in the same terrain across multiple seasons. The kind of knowledge that cannot be briefed in and cannot be read in patrol records, and that exists only in the person who earned it. What had the institution built in the officers who had stayed at the northern detachments for multiple years? And what did it lose when a posted officer left? The RCMP began introducing aircraft for northern patrol operations in the late 1920s, with sustained northern air patrol operations established in the early 1930s. What the patrol aircraft gave the institution was coverage, the ability to survey large sections of Arctic terrain in hours rather than days, to reach remote communities in emergencies that would have required a 3-day dog sled journey, to demonstrate sovereignty presence over territory that dog sled patrols could reach only in specific seasons and with specific preparations. What the aircraft patrol did not do was transfer the specific territorial knowledge that the dog sled era had required for survival. The RCMP officers who flew the Arctic in the 1930s had aerial views of the terrain. They did not have what the officer who had walked and driven a dog team over the same ground for 6 years carried about how the ice behaved at a specific crossing in January versus February, what the willow configuration at a specific drainage mouth meant about the trail conditions below, which community was under stress before any formal call had been made. The transition from dog sled to aircraft patrol changed the nature of the knowledge requirement. The aerial officer needed to read weather and navigation from above. He did not need the ground-level ice knowledge. The specific accumulated territorial knowledge that the dog sled era had built, the knowledge that Dempster had, and that the Fitzgerald Patrol was missing in the critical section, became operationally less urgent as aircraft coverage extended to territory that dog sled patrols could not efficiently reach. The knowledge was not transferred. It was not formally recorded. It was no longer as urgently required by the operational model that replaced the patrol it had served. The Dawson Patrol was last run as a regular dog sled patrol in the 1920s. The specific route knowledge that had been essential to its survival, including the mountain pass location on the Fort McPherson approach, ceased to be an active institutional requirement once aircraft could cover the route. The knowledge did not go into the records. It went with the people who held it. What the aircraft era gave the RCMP Northern Operation is documented in operational records. What the dog sled era knew about the Arctic Trail that the aircraft era no longer needed to know is not in those records. What did the transition from dog sled to aircraft patrol change about what the RCMP needed from its northern officers? And what happened to the specific body of knowledge that the dog sled era had required for survival? If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more northern trails, more dog sled crossings, more patrols, where the difference between arrival and failure was a specific piece of ground-level territorial knowledge that no institutional system had ever been designed to hold and record. What Inspector Fitzgerald had from 6 years in the North was genuine Northern experience. What he did not have was the specific knowledge of the mountain divide on the Fort McPherson approach that every successful Dawson patrol before him had carried, usually because a Gwich'in guide carried it for them. That gap between institutional patrol records and the actual knowledge the trail required is what this channel documents. And if you have a connection to the Fort McPherson territory, the Dawson patrol route, the early RCMP northern detachments, or the Gwich'in communities who lived in that terrain and guided those patrols, put it in the comments. What did your family know about those mountain crossings that the RCMP patrol records never contained? The Dempster Highway follows part of the route now. You can drive it in summer. Fitzgerald left Fort McPherson on December 21, 1910. He had been in the North for 6 years. He had made the Dawson crossing once before, in the other direction. What killed the patrol was not the cold and not the distance. Both were known quantities in the Canadian Arctic. What killed it was the absence of a specific piece of specific knowledge, the location of a specific mountain pass on a specific approach in a specific season that had been available at Fort McPherson before departure and that the patrol did not take with it. The Gwich'in people at Fort McPherson knew where the pass was. They had always known. Some of them had guided previous RCMP patrols through it. Nobody asked them on December 21, 1910. The pass is still in the same place. The Dempster Highway crosses it now. The knowledge of where it is has been encoded in asphalt and kilometer markers. What the Gwich'in guides knew about how to find it in January, in a year with deep snow, from the Fort McPherson side, in weather that was moving, that knowledge is not in the highway. It was in them. It went with them. The patrol records at the Fort McPherson detachment do not contain it. They never did. The institution never asked. The mountain divide still rises from the same drainage. The willows still grow at the valley bottoms. The correct draw and the incorrect draw still look nearly the same from the valley floor in January. The knowledge is somewhere else now,